Imagine a leader who, in just 4 short years, transformed a nation crippled by poverty into a beacon of self-reliance and hope. A leader who dared to defy global powers and demanded dignity for his people and all of the African continent. That leader was Thomas Isidore Sankara, the late president of Burkina Faso, mostly called Africa's Che Guevara. But Sankara was more than a president. He was a revolutionary leader who believed that the liberation of Africa lay not in mimicry of foreign systems, but in reclaiming its identity, its resources, and its unity. This led him to changing the name of the West African country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning the land of upright men. He championed Pan-Africanism as a key to breaking free from the chains of neocolonialism, imperialism, challenging Africa to envision a continent that thrives on its own terms. Today, as we remember his bold vision and untimely demise, we must ask the question, how far has Africa come on the path Sankara laid out? Is the continent ready to embrace his call for a united and self-reliant Africa, or will it let his dream fade into history? Distinguished audience of 4U Media Africa, let's embark on this journey of reflection and action inspired by the life and legacy of one of Africa's most fearless sons. In the course of today's edition, we shall be diving into this as a topic of discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome on board Talking Point to stay with us. Hello, Africa and the world. Thank you for joining us on a fresh edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel 4U Media Africa. Well, like you heard it in our preamble, today we remember an African icon, one of the key Pan-Africanists on the African continent, one who defended the interest of his people and the interest of the African continent. Today we are talking about Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, the late president of the West African country. And in the course of today's edition, we shall be asking ourselves the question, if Pan-Africanism is the new path for the African continent in this renewed time where we're seeing, Africa reconnecting with the vision that a key icon like Thomas Sankara had once shared during his time. And of course, to discuss this day, I'm being joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist, economist, and FINTECH expert. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us this day.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. Thank my co-panelists who will be joining us as well subsequently, and also thanking everyone who faithfully, tune in to listen to what we have to say. Hopefully, we are bringing some changes, and we are helping people develop their minds so far as their Pan-African agenda is concerned.
Indeed, and this edition comes just a few days before we shall be culminating this year 2024. And now, of course, in the course of today's edition, given that Africa is on the crossroads to a struggle that will redefine the future of the African continent. And now, like you mentioned, your co-panelist, who is His Royal Highness MUSI in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist, shall be joining us subsequently. But then, to debut today's conversation, there are great icons on the African continent that marked the history of Pan-Africanism. We're talking of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere. We're talking of Umyobe in Cameroon, and others that have been very paramount in the struggle of Pan-Africanism, of African liberation before this present time. And now, in a bit to debut today's conversation, Dr. FONGOD, who was Thomas Sankara, and why is his legacy still relevant in this contemporary society?
You have to understand this in relationship to the context when Thomas Sankara came on board, just when the colonial era on the African continent, as we knew it, was literally fading. And to have a leader who basically came up with the expression about the fact that we dare to invent our future, and that he who feeds us controls us, this was in antithesis to everything that Europe expected Africa to be. You have to also know this, that it's not just the notion that Africa in itself became a place for where every Western imperialistic power literally controlled, ruled, and used Africa as more of a plantation for whatever bidding they were trying to do so far as Europe was concerned. Africa was considered to be territories of Europe. And to have somebody who was, an African basically stepped up and say, we have to be able to invent our future. We have to be able to set the play to which it is that we have to become. That was something else that Europe was not going to stand for. So Thomas Sankara was one of those very early voices that brought to us the Pan-African movement, that brought to us whatever the Pan-African agenda was concerned, especially within as the colonial era on the African continent was, winding down or coming to a close in its former self. Because obviously we've had tremendous influence of Europe in Africa, which basically still speaks of the Pan-African, colonial structures that have endured on the African continent through its colonial legacy. We have to be able to celebrate Thomas Sankara, a man of great courage, a man who dared stood up, for the imperialistic power structures and was somebody who paid the ultimate price for it. Thomas Sankara truly is not just a Pan-African, but he is actually a son of the soil. He's an African. And anytime we talk about Pan-African, it's not as if to say we're trying to be able to set up a resistant movement. No. Anytime we talk about Pan-Africanism, it's not because we are trying to let the world understand that we are some kind of rebels. And so we are setting up some kind of a resistant front. We are like how white nationalists behave. And so we are setting up, coming out and saying, you know what, we are supposed to be this, we are this, and then we speak against the white power structure, or we are this, no, we are not rebels. We are African. We are African men and women who are seeking for their dignity and their freedom. And to not see us as that is basically, what the white imperialistic power structure looks like. That is basically what racism literally looks like. And so Africans who fight and pursue the freedom of the continent of Africa and of the Africans, whether in the diaspora or on the continent of Africa, the African peoples who are all over the world, it's something that should be celebrated rather than something else that should be scorned. So I'm an African, I'm a Pan-African, and so is everyone else who espouse the African ideal. We have always been great, all right? We have women on the continent of Africa that rule and lead. We have had men on the continent of Africa that rule and led kingdoms, great kingdoms that basically make everything that is in Europe look like a kindergarten. There was a time when the kingdom of Benin made London, look like a junkyard, all right? That was the kingdom of Benin in Nigeria. So we have to be able to celebrate who we've always been and to rise to what it is that was taken away from us. You cannot have shipped almost 50 million people out of the continent of Africa on an extended period of time, to talk less of those who basically died either in the Middle Passage or through this trans-Saharan slave trade, all right, and to those who basically was also shipped through the northeast of Africa, through the Horn of Africa. You cannot have taken that so much people out of the continent and still think that, the country will be what it is. You cannot have instituted all that was done through the colonial era and still think that we had, an equal playing field for us to espouse our ideals now. So, but now I think that we're moving closer and closer as the African basically rise up in consciousness and with the spirit of men like Thomas Sankara to be able to basically take our place at the table, of world dominance. And I think that time has come for us to rise. No matter what, we need to, we have to, we have no other choice.
Indeed, it is time for Africa to rise. And of course, since you already paved the way here for this conversation, Dr. FONGOD, now you're Pan-Africanist, and like we mentioned, his vision is still very much relevant in this society in which we find ourselves, in which the African continent finds itself. But then how did Sankara, redefine the terms of leadership and governance within the context of the African continent?
One of the things that we need to understand about a life like that of Thomas Sankara was not just his ideals. It was the fact that this was somebody who basically pushed forward for us to be able to involve in various sectors of life. This was somebody that many few people get to understand. He was heavily involved in agriculture. He spoke heavily, you know, of the fact that if you're going to basically rule a country, if you're going to push for a country, you have to make sure that we come to a level of self-achievement, that people basically look at themselves and say, I want to be great as to what is it that I do as a person. He was somebody who basically didn't like the idea of handouts. So all this foreign aid that country after country after country after country is pulling from, you know, getting from everywhere, that in itself was not the leadership of a man like Thomas Sankara. All right, he had this simplicity in leadership. And if all of the materials you will have read or you are reading about Thomas Sankara will speak of how simple he was. Maybe that is exactly what led to his demise, but he was quite simplistic. Which is not to say that he wasn't sophisticated. He was, but simplistic just simply means taking something that is as complex as anything else and then put it in very simple forms, just so that it's easy for folks to understand. He was quite a very complex man in terms of his leadership skill, but quite simplistic in the way in which it was delivered. And I think that that's something else that we really, really must be able, you know, to celebrate. And if you're going to look at what Thomas Sankara actually did, in the fact that he focused with youth and he focused on women, all right, which basically means he was looking for a way to bring everybody to the table. Let's find a way in which we're able to bring everyone who is of use, either they are useful to them, or either because we are training them for tomorrow, or either because we are trying to harness whatever potentials they do have and see how we can be able to build up a robust society. That was the life of Thomas Sankara. The notion that you have to come to power because you're from a certain power structure, or you're from a particular tribe, or you are like, or you're from one particular religion, that didn't matter. The salvation of Burkina Faso laid solely in the hands of those who were indigenous to that particular nation, and Thomas Sankara fully understood that the salvation of the African will have to be in the hands of the African. And this is why, if we look at somebody like Marcus Garvey has this famous expression of says, Africa is for Africans at home and abroad. We are talking about Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent of Africa. Those are the people who are responsible for the continent of Africa. I've forgotten, I think it might be CAMEROON, who says we need to look to the West, we need to look to the West, we look forward. We are not looking to the West, we are not looking to the East. Our main objective and focus is to look forward. We must be able to come into a place where tomorrow is our ultimate objective. We're forward looking. Whenever we look forward, serve is involved. Us as a people is involved, because Pan-Africanism brings about our culture. It brings about our belief systems. It brings everything that pertains to us as African. If we're going to look forward, we are not looking with the lens of the West, neither are we looking with the lens of the East. It's looking forward. We look forward with ourselves as Africans, and it is to push our ideals. And this is the mindset that somebody like Thomas Sankara brought to Pan-Africanism, and this was what Europe so much was afraid of.
Indeed, Dr. FONGOD, but then when we reverberate, this context of the African continent striving for a truly independent and united continent of Africa, could we, in the context of Sankara's vision, what would Pan-Africanism really mean? You're one of those that defends this ideology with, with pride. What does that really mean in the context of Africa, especially as Africa is fighting for its own liberation?
To promote self-reliance. We have to promote self-reliance. We have to basically come to a place where we stay. No matter what happens, we are promoting self-reliance. We cannot, at any one particular point in time, allow ourselves to be at the mercy of the West or to be at the mercy of the East. And that's the reason why once we are running from the West and then we are going to the East, I'm asking ourselves, have we not learned anything from history? What happened to us? Why can't we run to us? We're running to everybody else, but the only one person we are not running to is us. we need to be able to run to Africa. We have to be able to run to the African ideas. We have to run to African education. We have to run to African culture. We have to run to our norms, our traditions, and our values. Once you run to the West or you run to the East, what you're doing is you are selling your sovereignty, and your sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, has nothing at all to do with just a piece of territory, all right? It has everything to do with culture. It has everything to do with traditions. It has everything to do with value. And it's now quite expedient for a young person on the African continent to be able to wear something that is outside of the continent, all right? So you want to be known as somebody who is putting on Louis Vuitton, or you're putting on, Gucci or Nudu Brakla or some brand name. But yet none of us is actually celebrating what is African. We are not celebrating our own fabric. We are not celebrating, our own designers on the continent of Africa. We are basically celebrating every single thing that's outside of the continent. So the foot forward, going forward, looking at the continent of Africa, we have to be able to promote self-reliance. We have what it takes to be able to be everything that we're supposed to be. We have what it takes absolutely to be able to push the minds and the hearts of young Africans to where they're supposed to anchor. And for anyone who is an African to have any kind of anchor in life, your foot, your ideas, your mind, your determination must be anchored on the principles that is enshrined in who we are as Africans. And that should be on the continent of Africa. So far as I'm concerned, we have to put our best foot forward, and that best foot forward will be self-determination and self-reliance.
Speaking of self-reliance, on numerous occasions there have been calls for Africa to be united to push forward with the development of the African continent, notably intra-Africa trade, and you've evoked the issue of Africa, advertising or preserving its own culture, speaking of advocating for its own cultural identity, like its fabric, its clothing and others. But why is Africa's unity crucial in its fight or struggle for economic and political liberation?
First of all, we are struggling on the continent of Africa because when you start talking about any kind of an economic revolution and you start thinking how we can be able to harness trade, we must have something that we need to trade with. We must have something that we are trying to trade with. So on the continent of Africa, we basically rely on imports. A lot of things do come from outside of the continent. And so if you look at what we're exporting versus what we're importing, the difference is just crazy. We have to be able to rely on building the local industries, especially when it comes to getting into some kind of industrialization and building the local market by producing and transforming most of our raw materials into to finished goods. We have to be able to get into that space. What that means is we get a lot of young people working because we are developing the young market in that regard. And then once that is done, you'll soon discover that we on the African continent will now have enough right to start using our own products, not just importing them. We have to be able to find ways in which we bring manufacturing on the continent of Africa. Without manufacturing on the continent of Africa, the notion about trade makes no sense. I'm not going to import something from the United States of America just into a country like Nigeria and then to turn around and sell it into Cameroon. That is useless. I will import something from China into Ghana and then turn around and then sell the same thing I imported from China and then sell it to Togo. We have to find a way in which we manufacture. Without us manufacturing on the continent of Africa and build in manufacturing in different spaces and different sectors, that in itself will not actually help us so far as trade is concerned. For there to be any kind of a robust trade, there has to be demand. The market needs to be able to tell us exactly what is it that they want, what is it that they're looking for, based upon what has been our research and what is it that we're producing. And in different sectors of the economy on the African continent will tell us we want this here. And then maybe that will also bring us the incentives to start building the infrastructures that we need for easy transportation, for goods and services across the continent of Africa. Right now, you know, it's like, well, I just need to travel because I want to see this part of the country. That might not be good enough for the kind of investments that is needed to build up some of the railways and whatnot. So, but if we continue to push, all right, in the areas of industrialization, sooner or later, it will become too obvious and the demand will become so much that we have no choice but to initiate a project we should have done, which would be the intercontinental trade and also intercontinental railway systems that will allow for goods and services to move across the continent of Africa.
Indeed, and we recall that Thomas Sankara had always said it's always difficult to kill ideas. And of course, revolutionaries are individuals that could be murdered in some of his words. Now, looking at the aspect of ideas on the African continent, we always align ourselves in the struggle for Pan-Africanism, or better still, in the Pan-Africanist vision across Africa. We always align ourselves with these ideas of great minds that struggled for the liberation of the African continent. Now, in your perspective as a Pan-Africanist, how can we reconcile Sankara's some of his revolutionary ideas, which he had promoted all through his reign and still continues to, they're still seen in this society as the continent struggles for true independence, how can we reconcile this with some of the modern day challenges that the African continent is facing? And notably, we have economic crisis, we have political turmoils in different parts of the African continent. Amidst all this, including the issue of, climate change. So how do we bring about a synchronization in this too?
Well, first of all, I don't know where to start. Let me say this. I am not a big fan of climate change in its current form. And it's not because I'm stupid and a climate change denier. The point is, I think it is absolutely ludicrous for me to sit over here and start pushing for a climate change, bandwagon when the climate change is only expedient to the West. Period. It's only good to the West. Once the West says this is what climate change is and this is what we need to do, and then they look in their backyard and they say, you know what? This is good, this is the template, and this is what we need to adhere to, fine. Outside of the West, climate change is nothing else but a farce. What am I saying? In America, you're not permitted to cut any tree down if there is no way of reforestation. You need to cut and plant. If you cut, you plant. You're not allowed to do any kind of mining in the West, just anyhow, mining license, and then environmental protections. There has to be environmental studies being made where you are mining before you mine anything. Whatever it is you're taking out of the ground, there has to be a way in which you do it in such a way that that particular piece of land will be used for, especially for agriculture or for settlement long after the mining expedition is over. Unfortunately, on the African continent, that's not the same case. But yet, the people who are basically buying what is illegally mined on the continent of Africa are all the major corporations in the West. So please save me the idea or the bickering on how we have to talk about climate change when the climate change we are talking about has nothing to do, in essence, with the African. Time and time again, we have put locations like the DRC, Congo. We have got to locations like in the mining zones in Nigeria and in Ghana, where the water system, in Cameroon also, when the water system are completely disappearing, rivers are dying, and the water systems or streams are so toxic that you can't even use it to water plants. The plants die instantly. That is what is going on, on the continent of Africa. We cut our trees like there's no tomorrow. Show up in a place like Cameroon and see the amount of trees that is leaving the continent. You wonder if anything else is left. But you cannot do that in the United States. You can't do that out here. So what does this talk about climate change when we are not even protecting the environment? What I believe sincerely is this, and in the minds of Thomas Sankara, we have to be able to start thinking more about our own environment. We have to start thinking about the continent, no mindful word that it is home. We have to start thinking that long after the mining is gone, all the mining expeditions is over, long after the last gram of gold has been mined, the land will have to be used for agriculture or something else, because frankly speaking, we'll have nothing else to do but to return back to agriculture. Once that is not the case, and us as Africans, we sell the land, we sell everything with it, and we also destroy the land in the process, what are we leaving for the future generation? What are we leaving for our own children? And when we have leaders who are so selfish, self-centered, has absolutely no desire, no ambition to be able to leave a legacy for the next generation, they are like what my mother would call chop and die, all right? Which basically means I eat and I die, and obviously, you know, that's it anyway, so who cares? I mean, we have to come into a place where we are absolutely, with 100% interested in building a continent that was handed to us by men like Thomas Sankara, by men like Kwame Nkrumah, W.D.R. Du Bois, people who understood Julius Nyerere, people who understood the ideals of the continent, the minds of the continent, and knew perfectly well that certain things had to be done. If not, we would lose the continent, not just because somebody took it away from us, but because we sold the whole entire continent, you know, like in a yard sale. We sold it like on an auction, like it was some kind of used clothes. We just sold it. And that is exactly what I see happening on the continent of Africa. We must become Pan-African, and believe me, if this Pan-Africanism would have to survive, the militant version of Pan-Africanism will have to hold sway. We must be able to say, no matter what happens, we'll put our foot down and say, the continent of Africa belongs to Africans at home and abroad, and anyone who is literally selling the continent, no matter how you're selling it, all right, in terms of ideas, in terms of economic diplomacy, in terms of governance, we will do whatever it takes to stop you.
Indeed, and speaking of the African continents, we're noting that this will come with a change of mindset. It will come with having political will at the various levels, and of course a change. And this would equally go with revamping the education system that will exist within the continent of Africa, noting that history must be told. Now, Dr. FONGOD, we've been citing that it's important for Africa to reconnect with history, for it to be able to see the vision which great leaders like Thomas Sankara had for the African continent, for Africa to be able to get to that point it intends to be. Speaking of which, what role does this aspect of self-reliance, how does it play in the path of Africa's freedom?
Well, if we do not espouse self-reliance, we're in trouble. Because the reality is that we're going to basically live a life where we are constantly dependent, like how Africa is at this present moment, on everybody outside of the continent. So if you look at Burkina Faso, as we speak, is free. It's free of all foreign debts. As we speak, $4.5 billion US, Burkina Faso paid that off. Now, which was something else that is totally unheard of on the continent of Africa. No foreign aid was able to help them pay off. Now, what that means is Burkina Faso has this vantage point where if Burkina Faso speaks, everybody else has to listen. And the reason is because we are not asking anything from you. And this is what I've always believed, that the idea that we have to wait for foreign direct investments on the continent of Africa, or to wait for some other corporations outside of the continent of Africa to basically develop, our small to medium-sized enterprises in Africa, that itself is a farce. I believe that on the continent of Africa, we have very creative ways in which we can build up our own creative financial instruments on the continent of Africa to be able to develop the local market and get local to small to medium-sized enterprises basically producing at peak production, and also be able to sell that across the continent of Africa. That in itself will bring economic development, sustainable economic growth across the region and get a lot of other secondary industries or businesses being developed as a result of major ones basically coming along. If you look at when MTN came onto the continent of Africa, look at the secondary industries that developed as a result of MTN. That is what we need to be able to do so far as the continent is concerned. Find ways in which we build up the local market, get a lot of local investments into to support the thriving business sector we have on the continent of Africa, rather than always waiting to receive money from abroad or waiting for some money to come in as a result of foreign direct investments into the continent or into our countries on the continent of Africa. So far as I'm concerned, that in itself is not what we really need. We have to look within. We need to look at ourselves. We need to look at who we are. We need to be able to start with us. If there be anybody who needs to build anything, it has to be us. If there's anybody who has to be an investor in anything, it has to be us. We have to be the first in the line to support the African ideal. We can no longer say we are Africans, and yet the only place we cease to invest in is on the continent of Africa. And this goes to all the Africans in the diaspora. The continent of Africa needs you. If you're thinking about doing any kind of investments anywhere else in the world, make sure the investments is primarily on the continent, in the continent of Africa, because Africa, it's not just ripe, it's home. And there's no way to espouse the African ideals and Pan-Africanism if we do not invest back home. Investing on the continent is paramount.
Indeed, and of course, you said this investment is going to, help the continent in achieving these developments it seeks to achieve. Now, what role would changing or revamping the education system, because if we are fighting for Pan-Africanism, if the Pan-African vision has to come into full limelight, I think the education system will have a very key role to play. So how does this find its own place in this society in which we find ourselves, where we have the African continent still in some sort of bondage of neocolonialism?
What I believe is that none of our children should be allowed to graduate out of our school systems on the continent of Africa if the history of the African has not been taught to them, or they do not have basic ideas on the history of the African. There is no reason why they should graduate. Excuse me. And the reason for that is because we have heard and we have studied everybody else. And the only person we haven't studied is ourselves. We know everything about European history. We know everything about the Americas. We are students of Plato, but we are not students of Hemotep. We are students of the Great Plains in Ireland, but we know nothing about the Macabuboi in South Africa. We are students of the Great Plains in Northern California that is good for agriculture, but nobody is talking to us about the boundaries of Cameroon. We are students of the Great Falls, like, the Great Falls in Niagara Falls in the US, but nobody's talking about, the falls in places like Zimbabwe. None of us knows anything absolutely about the continent of Africa, but yet we know everything outside of the continent of Africa. No child should be allowed to graduate out of our educational systems on the continent of Africa if that individual do not know the history of the African. We must be able to know the history of the African. That's who we are. It's our culture. We must know where we're coming from. If we do not know our past, I wonder if we are able to charter a course for our future. Our past is extremely quite important for us to know, because that in itself will be the process of eradicating the chokehold that the colonial system has had on the minds of the African, that a young person sitting on the continent of Africa is more attuned to whatever is happening in California by virtue of Hollywood, all right, and all the junk that Hollywood has to give. And even when you start looking at our own local industries, like what is happening in Nollywood, all right, and wherever movies is being produced on the continent of Africa, there's always this temptation to model whatever is coming out of the West, not modeling who we are as a people, and not pushing our own culture, our language, and not pushing our own belief structures on the continent of Africa. All we're doing is pushing whatever is coming out of the West, and not knowing that Hollywood in itself, it's there pushing the American ideals and the American agenda. Because in most cases, in some of the movies that has been produced by Hollywood, the Pentagon actually has a budget just to support whatever Hollywood is producing, especially when it comes to movies that has to do with war or that has to basically portray the US military. Yet on the continent of Africa, there is none. We are not talking about us. We are allowing others to write our stories. We are not writing our own stories. And so we need to absolutely revamp our own educational system. Because if we don't, somebody is going to tell our story. And believe me, when they tell our own story and not us, it will not be in good light. It will be to their advantage and to our own disadvantage. One of the major issues why this is extremely very important, if you look at the AI, where we are right now, if you get to any artificial intelligence platform, maybe something like ChatGPT, and you're able to put in a query, and you're trying to get some specific information about the continent of Africa, that information is going to come to you primarily from sources in the West. It's not sources on the continent of Africa, which basically means that ChatGPT, an artificial intelligence platform, is now basically learning. And what it's learning is it is actually going through an educational system that is literally written by white people for Africa. It's not written by Africans. It's not learning anything because we have no structure on the continent of Africa to say, this is who we are, this is what we are, this is what we've been through, and this is where we're going. We don't have that. So every single thing else that ChatGPT, for example, is learning, or more, or any other artificial AI model, whatever they're learning, is what is primarily being permitted by the West, on the internet. We have to be able to find a way in which we insert ourselves and build our own model and insist on who we are and not to allow the West tell the African story. An African with an Afrocentric mindset must be able to tell the story of an African from an Afrocentric perspective. If that's not the case, believe me, we are losing the battle.
Indeed, and if Africa must liberate itself from all the shackles, it will be a time for Africa to be able to, conquer neocolonialism, conquer imperialism. I remember a couple of days ago, or better still, over a week ago, we saw the Burkina Faso transition president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, that had stated that the country was very committed in fighting all forms of imperialism that would, bring down the West African country. And that should resonate with other parts of the African continent. In this struggle for liberation, I think it's time for action, for Africans to be able to, pick up, to actually wake up and actually take the action which the desire to see in their respective leaders for the true independence of the African continent. As we speak, present-day Africa is reeling from debt. It's actually, going through a lot of political transitions. We've seen political upheavals and political tensions in some countries across the African continent, economic impasse, and others. With that said, how can this, with this present-day neocolonialism in all its forms that do exist in some countries across the African continent, how does this continue to hinder the progress, developments, and further liberation of the African people?
I think that if you look at somebody like W.E. Du Bois, who said that the 20th century problem was one of a problem of the color line, I think, was one of the problems of the color line. What that meant was that the issues of the 20th century was fragmented across a race. And obviously, the black person or the black man was in a whole entire category all by himself, and the rest of the world was in a category all by themselves. If you're going to start thinking about what we can be able to do so far as the African continent is concerned, is the fact that we need to look within. And the only way we have to look within is to basically espouse the ideas of the ideals of the African. What that means is this. Most often at times, most of our own political leaders have this tendency to look out west. They travel to the west, they travel to the east. And all they do is to go out and basically, create this phantom I don't know exactly what you call it, where they think that for some reason this alignment with the West basically is quite meaningful, and this photo ops that they do in places like Washington, D.C., in places like London or Paris is something, that they look forward to in the tenets of their presidency. And not understanding that we really have to be able to focus on the continent of Africa to build the continent, because you have not been elected into a particular position, for any kind of self-interest. You have been elected into that position because we believe that you can be able to serve the continent well or the country well. So for us to be able to move to an environment where we start looking favorably and start building the continent that we want and the countries that we want, we have to be able to get African leaders who are absolutely not corrupt. The reality is this. The only reason why we will be celebrating and looking at every single thing as from the West or the East is because, frankly speaking, we are absolutely very, very corrupt. Most of the monies that is being sent to us on the continent of Africa, it be from whichever international organizations, the World Bank, whichever organizations is trying to bring some kind of structural investment into structural development on the continent of Africa, we end up eating, we end up stealing. That is the easiest way for us to pocket monies, because most of that basically comes into the country through banks we own and control, and we can be able to manipulate figures and do whatever it takes, and you are left in a situation where you don't know how much money we owe and how much money we have paid and how much money is the interest. I think it is Lapro Dembanga, my most treasured African philosopher, that's I call him, an artist from Cameroon, who said that every single day, young people, old people, it doesn't matter, they go around and they are paying this thing called national debt. They have held the person who is basically the vegetable seller on the local market in Africa. We call them in Cameroon bayam salams. They have held them to ransom to pay part of the national debt. The guys riding the motorbikes, they have also held them to ransom to pay the national debt. They have held everybody ransom to pay the national debt. But he had three questions, I think 2 or 3. He said, how much is the national debt, right? And then he said, nobody knows. How much have we paid? Nobody knows. And how much is left? Nobody knows. Do you even know what the interest is? Nobody knows. And then in the classical Lapiro ways, it says, this one graph for faith. Unfortunately, I can't translate that, which basically means, I would say, that this is the highest form, okay, of 419, or this is the highest form of scamming, all right? And so you have to come into a place where we realize that if you're going to start thinking, in essence, about who we are as a people, we must be able to do so, knowing mindfully well that the kind of leadership we have is a leadership that espouses the African ideal. It's a leadership that believes so much on the continent of Africa, like a Thomas Sankara, somebody who is willing to die for the country, not the country to die for them. You cannot come into the state, you cannot come into a particular nation and you're not willing. You cannot be a president if you're not willing to give your life for the seat. You cannot be a president, but you're willing to sell the whole entire damn country, all right, murder everybody in the country just so that you can stay in power or you can remain alive. No, if you are going to be the president, you must have the kind of mandate, that says, I'm willing to give up my life for the salvation of the country. Thomas Sankara did it. I'm willing to give up my life for the salvation of the country. Julius Nyerere did it. I'm willing to give up my life for the salvation of the country. People like Kwame Nkrumah were in line. I'm given to give up my life for the salvation of the country, or a particular ideal that espouses the agenda of the African at home and abroad. We'll be talking about people like Martin Luther. Whichever way it is, we have to be able to fight to make sure that we get leaders into power who understands the African ideal, who are people who are willing to be Pan-Africans and who are also willing to die for the nation and for the continent.
Indeed, and speaking of the unification of the African continent, I would like to ask, now, since we are discussing this in the course of today's edition of Talking Point, what would a united African continent look like, and is it actually achievable in our lifetime?
I think it is. I think United Africa is absolutely achievable. Whoever knew that in a place like Niger, we'll be talking about the kind of economic growth that they're having in Niger. Whoever knew that in the place of Burkina Faso, we'll be talking that they've paid up all the national debts and Niger is now free. Or Burkina Faso is now free. Whoever knew that a place like Rwanda, after the great genocide, all right, that more than 20 years ago, that clobbered the whole entire nation, that in the hands of the West, in 100 days, 800 people, about close to 1 million people got massacred, not with machine guns, but with machete. Whoever knew that the country would have a turnaround like it did under Paul Kagame? I think that there is great hope for the continent of Africa in our own lifetime, and I think that a united Africa, a united Pan-Africa will basically come forth. I believe that the future absolutely looks bright so far as the African continent is concerned in that regard. What troubles me is not the fact that Africa is not rising in its consciousness, but what troubles me is that for some strange reason, we have leaders on the continent of Africa who has not gotten the memo. We have leaders on the continent of Africa who has not read maybe my blog post. They have not read any Facebook post from me or from any other Pan-African, which basically states this: your legacy on the continent of Africa is not tied to Europe. Your legacy on the continent of Africa is not tied to the West, neither is it tied to the East, it's tied to the African. No kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York, growing up in Stanton, growing up somewhere in Shanghai, somewhere in Manila, the Philippines, will remember you. The only people who will have to remember who you are will be members or people from the country to which it is that you have been given the task to govern. So if you are thinking about building legacy, it is absolutely left in your hands to be able to rule your individual nations with a lot of equity, fairness, with a lot of art, with a lot of love, and instill peace no matter what. And to be able to make sure that long after you are gone, your name will not echo within anybody's corridor in pain. Your name will echo in the hearts of men with peace and love. I think that that is what is needed for most of our African leaders to be able to understand that they can't continually they can't continue this mindset of always looking to the East, of always looking to the West, and they're thinking that somehow, just because you know somebody like Barack Hussein Obama on a first-name basis, that simply means that you're doing well. No, you're not. What matters is if somebody like Atangana or somebody like Shola in Nigeria or somebody, God knows where, in which African countries knows you and knows exactly what you've done in the interest of that country. And believe me, if your individual country will not celebrate you, if you have expounded the Pan-African ideals, the continent will celebrate you, and black populations all around the world, the black populations, the black peoples of the world will be able to celebrate you because we know that you stood for what is right for the continent of Africa. We are talking about Thomas Sankara today, celebrating him today, long after his demise, and yet none of us, hail from Burkina Faso. That's a testament to a true spirit of a Pan-African, and that's what every African leader should aspire for.
Indeed, and it's 75 years since the demise of that African icon, and which we're remembering this day. I've just noted that it was commemorated on Friday. But since we're having this conversation, how do we ensure that Sankara's vision, which is so much alive across the African continent, within Africa and in the diaspora, he fought for, gender equality. He equally advocated for the preservation of African values, which remains central to this vision of Pan-Africanism that is so much alive in this present day. With that said, how do we ensure Africans, be it from those that are youngsters, trying to still comprehend or still learning about the history of the African people, those great minds that fought for the liberation of the African continent, as we try to recognize with this, this struggle, this vision that these great leaders like Thomas Sankara, Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, you know, Muammar Gaddafi, which they had for the African continent. How do we keep their visions alive, given some of the flaws that are present in this contemporary society?
I think that the flaws is there, and the reality is that no matter what we do, it looks more like we're continually going to be facing some of these challenges. But if you're looking to look at some of the things that somebody like Thomas Sankara brought, which is the issues of equality, basically getting women, children, and made everybody involved in the political arena and in whatever stuff that they were doing, I thought that that was incredibly good. I also do not want us to confuse, especially when it comes to the issues of the feminist movement on the African continent. What I believe, sincerely, is that when we start talking about equality, we need to be careful that we are not looking at equality of outcome, we are looking at equality of competence. And the reason why this is extremely very important is because with equality of outcome, what we are saying in essence is this, that we're going to put anybody, just because we're trying to basically make a particular organization have some kind of gender equality, we're just going to bring people and put them here and there. You're destroying, and you're going to destroy a business, you'll destroy a government, you'll destroy a lot of things in that regard. What I believe is competence. You need to be able to allow people who are competent in what they do to do what they do. And this in itself does not mean that women are not competent. We have series of women who ruled the continent of Africa at different times in history. Two of the most prolific women to ever come out of the Kemetic civilization, this is before the Common Era, were women, all right? So the ideas that we have so far as, gender equality on the continent of Africa should not be confused with this thing that is basically cooking out in the West. That being said, I also want us to understand that every other gender studies that has been made, especially when it has to do with equality, the Scandinavian nations has been prolific. If we look at some of the research papers coming out of a place like Helsinki University in Finland, you will discover that no matter how much they tried to go to create an egalitarian society where everybody was equal and everything was okay in relationship to gender, men will always do what men loves to do. Men are given into engineering, they're given into things. Women are given into people, and so most women go into medicine, most women are medical doctors, most women are nurses, meanwhile most men are engineers. And that's just the way it is. You can begin with 10, sooner or later, everybody will move into their quadrants because we are skilled in that regard. So what we love to do, that's what we love to do. What women love to do, that's what women love to do. So women have the capacity to become anything that they want to be. They have the mind to do whatever they want to do, and nobody stops that. And I think that that is part of the ideals that we need to basically embrace as Pan-African. Women have skill set that is remarkable. And believe me, it's not about intuition. I'm talking about skill sets in almost every phase of life. Two black women were very instrumental in the calculations for the Apollo mission to the moon, to be able to have their re-entering into the Earth. These were done by women. If you've watched the movie Hidden Figures, 3 African-American women did that. So that speaks to how powerful we can be, especially, our women can be with the capacities that they do have. So the ideas that somewhat, we have to basically start talking about with gender equality and whatnot is antiquated, so far as I'm concerned. Let's focus on what really matters, which means bring everybody on board. I don't care if you're a woman, you're a man, it doesn't matter. Do you have what it takes for you to be able to help me? Let's get it done. Bring it, and let's do what we need to do so far as the continent is concerned. I think that's what the African is looking for. In that regard, we can be able to export some of the ideas of Marcus Garvey by basically doing major investments in agriculture. His ideas were simple. If we cannot feed ourselves, we are never independent. Food security is the most important thing that any nation can ever have. If we are not able to feed ourselves, believe me, we'll always be at the mercy of anyone who has the capacity to feed us. And if that was going to hold sway, we must be able to invest heavily in the agricultural sector and use the ideas and the minds, the visions, the desires of a man like Thomas Sankara to push for a serious economic belt agricultural belt, especially in places like the Sahel, in places, just a little bit north of the savannah or within the savannah belt on the continent of Africa. If we are able to push that, we have the opportunities to be able, to export food products out of the continent of Africa, and may I say purely organic food products, which the West desperately needs, from lands that has not been contaminated by lead, land that has not been contaminated by all kinds of hard metals that is not good for the body. The continent of Africa, with 60% of the world arable land, is good for agriculture. We need to be able to harness that with the vision, with the aspirations of a man like Thomas Sankara.
Indeed, and like you said, African countries, some African countries are moving in that light with so much speed, of course, to make Africa known at the global stage. Now, given that we're discussing, how to bring about change on the African continent, now, you earlier were mentioning that it was imperative for Africans to be able to, at the respective nations, be at the level of leadership, to be able to, fight corruption, push for regional integration, admit others, but why Africa is trying to balance the fight against these flaws that are impeding, progress on the African continent, what lessons should African leaders and, of course, Africans themselves learn from some of the policies and actions of the African icon, Thomas Sankara?
That no culture is inferior to another. And I think that this is something that we need to push. If there was anybody who espoused this more than anyone else, was Sankara. Sankara was instrumental in basically helping the African to understand that her cultures were not inferior to that of the West. And if that was going to be the case, then we really start pushing for everything that is African, and we start pushing to be able to start consuming that which is African. And I think that that's absolutely where we start with this conversation. The reason for that is because if we are not even able to buy us, who are we going to sell us to? If you're not even, if we are not able to buy us, who do you think will basically purchase us if we are not in that space? For example, I had a conversation with a gentleman who had gone for his boarding. He has no hair, and so he's boarding, and he had gone to this clinic to try to get some kind of a hair transplant. But it was not actually a hair transplant. It was a way to save whatever little hair that he had on. And in conversation with the gentleman who was actually helping him, he realized that what the man was wearing on his head was actually some kind of a wig. It's called an install, something that they just glue on the top of your head. Yeah. And his idea was, well, if I'm trying to get this man, I'm going to spend maybe $10,000 to get my hair restored, how come this gentleman has nothing on his head? Which is a clear testament to whatever he sells does not work, right? So it might not be his fault, but clearly speaking, you cannot be selling something you're not using. You cannot come out and say, this is exactly what I think we should be able to do, and yet whatever stuff you're thinking that we should do is something else that you yourself absolutely has zero interest in, because you are not using it. You are not participating in the program that you say it's so wonderful for the continent. And this is why we need to be able to institute on the continent of Africa that we must, the Pan-African culture has to be pushed, promoted on the continent of Africa. I think that we also have to find ways in which we give incentives to companies that basically pushes for the Pan-African culture. Why will a company like MTN be inviting people outside of the continent of Africa to come and do any kind of perform, maybe artists from outside of the continent of Africa just because, they're from outside of the continent of Africa? That's insane. Why will we not bring people who are within the continent of Africa so that we can espouse the African ideas and the African culture? Why are we celebrating artists on the continent of Africa who are absolutely not developing, designing whatever it is that is African, but are copying every single thing from outside of the continent of Africa? I believe that we must be able to push for the consumption of African products. We must be able to push for the consumption of African ideas. We must farm our own ideas on the continent of Africa, and we must consume the ideas that we are farming. And we must be able to make sure that our young people and our children are also consuming the same ideas that we are farming on the continent of Africa. If our ideas are not good enough for us, trust me, nobody's going to buy our ideas. And the only reason why the West can be able to sit and treat Africans as, children, and basically look at our leaders on the continent of Africa and ask them to show up in Washington, D.C., is because they believe that African leaders are still toddlers, not just in political terms, but everywhere in economic terms as well. We are still toddlers. We are children. First of all, just the economy of a place like California, basically, if California, in itself, which is a state in the U.S., if it was a country, it would be the fifth largest economy in the world, all right? But in that being said, we cannot give out our own sovereignty by not showing up and being respected, but showing up in the place and be disrespected that as it occurs, every time when we get invited everywhere else, either to the east or to the west, or, God knows where we show up. That's crazy. If anybody wants to have a conversation with us on the African continent, they either have to fly to Africa or there's no conversation. I think we might be able to use a platform like Zoom to have that conversation. No African leader should be permitted to fly out of the continent of Africa to go and talk with any African president anywhere else. And especially, you can go on those solo missions, but if it has to be this group collective thing, when, the African leaders are invited to Washington, D.C. to listen to any U.S. president talk to them and lecture them on what their ideas on the African continent will be, that in itself is crazy. I think that if that was going to be the case, we can actually have a Zoom meeting, give us a PowerPoint presentation on what your ideas are as the US president on Africa. Don't invite African leaders to show up in Europe or to show up in the US, just because they have to be lectured by you. I think that the African does not find that funny, and we as Pan-Africans, we don't find that funny. We need to be respected, and I think that our respect and dignity must be something that the West basically espouse. That is the height of white supremacy. And we will say this over and over and over again. The white supremacy is when the West basically sits and watch. I don't care if it's Barack Hussein Obama, which I care less for, will sit in Washington, D.C. and invite African leaders. That is a white supremacy structure. It's a white supremacy concept. Africans are not toddlers. We are men, grown men, and we don't allow our fathers, unfortunately, our fathers and great-grandfathers are leading us these days, to show up in Washington, D.C. and anywhere else, and basically just because they're trying to come and espouse whatever ideas that they have. I think we must focus on the continent of Africa. Every single thing that we do must be Afrocentric in nature. We must look within, not without. Salvation of Africa is onshore, not offshore. Everyone who is on the continent of Africa must be able to see within their leaders that this man truly believes in this nation and is willing to die for this nation. If we truly did that, our road systems in our individual countries will be very different. All right? We will have the best roads everywhere in the world because we believe that this is where we are, this is home. Home is nowhere else. You cannot say this is home and you're living somewhere else. You cannot be an African president and your bank account is in Anvers, or your bank account is somewhere in Switzerland. No, your bank account should be in the country. Your investment should be in the country. Whatever God and corruption has blessed you with over the years should be in the country. The only reason why you're taken out of the country is because you're trying to hide it. I get that, but there has to be a way in which every single thing is rests within the country to which it is that you're governing. Do you know how many money owned to the African is stocked up, locked up in Switzerland? And the Swiss is the least corrupt place on planet Earth, holding loots of the worst corruption in human history, looting Africa, and then we still consider Switzerland to be the least corrupt place on planet Earth. Switzerland should be on the top. Number one corrupt nation on planet Earth should be the Swiss. Unfortunately, that's not the ideas that the world has, but we as Pan-Africans, we see that, and it's quite shameful, and it is just ludicrous. We need to be able to do things differently.
Exactly. That's why we host shows like this to, enlighten the African continent on the way forward while Africa fights for its own liberation. Now, to wrap up today's conversation with you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, in your capacity as a Pan-Africanist and an economist. Now, in a bid not to prevent the silencing of voices like those of Thomas Sankara, which we once saw on the African continent, and the fight for Africa's liberation, charting the way forward, how can the African continent, especially young Africans that are still very fresh in mind with this vision for the African continent as Africa struggles for its own true liberation, how do they carry on with this torch of a Pan-Africanism?
We need to be able to breed a generation of Thomas Sankaras. We need to have a continent with 1 billion Thomas Sankaras. We need to have a continent with so much Thomas Sankaras that if you basically had to start eliminating Thomas Sankara like the West would like to do, you would have to eliminate the whole entire continent, and that in itself is not possible. That is the way we escape this trap. That is the way we get Africa to breed and Africa to believe and Africa to rise. We must be able to make sure that we replicate, duplicate, multiply, whatever stuff we have to do in a geometric progression as fast as we can. Young Africans who understands the vision, the mandate, and who understand the ideals of what it means to be a Pan-African. We must be able to teach them the history of the Africa from an Afrocentric perspective and have teachers who will teach them from that perspective as well. We cannot have Eurocentric people or Eurocentric mindset teachers who are teaching Africans, about Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism must not be taught by Europeans to Africans or people who have been indoctrinated, educated in a Eurocentric mindset, people who understand more about Plato than they do about Hermotep, men who will read who knows more about the Republic, written by Plato than they do about the Book of the Dead from the Kemetic civilization. We need to be able to have young Africans who understand exactly what Africa is, who understands the story of men coming out of the Benin Kingdom in Nigeria, who understands people or the Orishas of the Yoruba Kingdom, who understands that mythological structure and its implication in life, who understands fully about places like the Great Zimbabwe and its place in human history, who understand places like the Makampubwe, who understand places like the Great Timbuktu, who understands men like Kwame Nkrumah, W.D. Du Bois, who understands people like Thomas Sankara. We have to be able to get young people who fully understands Africa in its intricacy, in its vision, in its glorious past. Once that is done, the rest is history. And the reason is because once a people are desperate for change, once a people have gotten to a place where there is nothing that will stop them to be able to get the change that they need, where their liberty outweighs their fear for an AK-47, there will be no gun loud enough that will be able to stop the African from freedom. I believe that that is the only way in which we are able to get Africa to the place where Africa needs to be. We are Africans, true. We have always been Africans. That too is true. And the reality is, are we always going to be Africans? That is left to us. We can be able to build up a society, a future for our children in which it is that they will not have to wonder and doubt, if they are humans or subhumans or why Africa is the way it is. We will have to build a society where young people growing up on the continent of Africa will not have to look at Europe and the West and have this desire to travel out of the continent of Africa because the West looks so good or the East looks wonderful. We should be able to look at places like Cairo and say, wow, I want to be in Cairo. I want to be in Benin. I want to be in Kigali. I want to find ways in which I can go to the mining belt, like in a place like Goma in the DRC. We have to be able to push for the continent to become the maker for the black man. I think that we have to push the continent to become a religious refuge, an economic refuge, and a political refuge for all the black peoples of the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your insight on today's edition of the program. Just to note that in the spirit of Ubuntu, Pan-Africanism is a new path for the African continent. It was an immense pleasure to have you share your input on today's edition of the program.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, today we were remembering the African icon Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, the former president of the West African country, also known as Africa's Che Guevara, and we're asking ourselves the question, Pan-Africanism better discoursing? It was a new part for the African continent. We believe you learned a lot from today's conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be putting a stop to today's edition of Talking Point over For You Media Africa. Thank you for your keen attention, the audience, the staying company over numerous transmissions.